Hi, in this film we're going to talk about the issues surrounding sexual ethics. That is, issues surrounding such behaviour as premarital sex and whether or not it's morally okay to use contraception. And remember that when we're considering the ethics of personal behaviour, there are three things that we might employ in our argument. One is motive. What is motivating our action? Second, the nature of the action itself, because theories such as Kantian ethics and natural law argue for the intrinsic badness of certain actions. And thirdly, there are consequences, and we can't just ignore them, even though sometimes we may prefer to. We can't just ignore consequences in the moral equation. Different theories place different emphasis at different points. For example, utilitarians only put the emphasis on consequences. They don't consider motive or whether an action is of itself intrinsically bad. Whereas natural law theorists and Kantian ethicists, they talk about the intrinsic goodness or badness of an action and define it in a particular way. Let's begin by thinking about autonomy, because personal choice and the right to choose is thought to be a moral good when it comes to personal sexual behaviour. And John Stuart Mill, in his essay on liberty, talks about the harm principle. The only reason, he argues, for restricting the behaviour of other people is to prevent harm to others. But of course that slightly begs the question, what are the harms that, for example, premarital sex might produce? For example, those harms could include psychological damage to the person themselves if they're highly promiscuous. Now, Kant has the postulate of autonomy. That means it's a starting point that he doesn't prove but just posits or postulates. And autonomy means self-rule or self-legislation. Kant argues we should make the moral law for ourselves. But the problem is that purely emphasizing self-rule fails to take into account a dimension of ethics, which is the social dimension. So there is both a personal and a social element within sexual ethics and sexual behavior. So, for example, premarital sex in our culture is often seen to go bad when people are accused of rape. And the issue there is, did the person actually consent? Did the person exercise their autonomy or their own right to choose? And of course, in many cases, as judges sometimes point out, it is highly ambiguous because both parties might well have been drunk and their memories of the events are extremely shady, hazy and shadowy and imperfect. And for that reason, some of these cases get thrown out in court. But I want to suggest today that the social element of personal behaviour should not be ignored. So the social element here is, how do you behave when you're drunk? Do you even consider sexual relations with somebody when they're drunk? Because the context there is different from when autonomy and self-legislation, choice, can be freely given. Now, let's consider for a moment consequences, because consequences, Peter Vardy argues, is something that has changed in the last 100 years. The reason for that is that the utilitarian balance of consequences has shifted due to changes in medicine, in scientific discoveries, for example, the contraceptive pill and the cures for many, indeed most, sexually transmitted diseases. And also the change in legislation, which indicates a change in social attitudes. So you've had the Divorce Reform Act of the 1960s, and you've had the Abortion Act of 1967. Now, what does this do? It changes the social context of sexual behaviour, so that some of the negatives, what we call the taboos, the things that society finds unacceptable, start to diminish, and indeed in our present age probably they have disappeared altogether. There is no taboo in our society, it seems, about abortion, and there is a much, much lower taboo about premarital sex and two people living together and people having children out of wedlock and so on. So as the utilitarian balance shifts, more pleasure than pain, so the calculation changes. But does this make us happier? You could argue, possibly, that it doesn't. Why? For two reasons. There are still social utility questions about these changes. They may represent a change in attitude, but the idea of us being happy may include promoting values such as loyalty, faithfulness, compassion. And indeed, from a personal point of view, there are always the psychological consequences of our behaviour, the sort of person that we end up being, the sort of character that we have, the implications that perhaps we cannot know until years afterwards. For example, the guilt that may, in some circumstances, surround the decision to have an abortion.